Story 1. I was sitting in the third vehicle, a white Land Cruiser packed with food containers, folded fabric, and my aunt's ceramic dishes wrapped in newspaper. My mother was beside me, already sweating through her celebration dress. We had left Tamanrasset before dawn, 12 vehicles in total, stretched across the piste like a slow-moving bead necklace through the sand. My cousin Nadia was the bride. She was riding in the lead vehicle with her father. I remember watching the dust cloud from that first truck and thinking how beautiful it looked, how the desert accepted us like it always did, indifferently, in silence. Nobody noticed the sky changing until it was too late. I was half asleep against the window when my uncle, who was driving, said something quietly in Tamashek. I looked up and saw the southern horizon had turned a solid wall of reddish-brown. Not clouds, not haze, a wall, standing vertical and moving toward us with a speed that made no sense for something so enormous. I had seen sandstorms before, small ones, the kind that sting your face and pass in 20 minutes. This was different. This had a shape like something deliberate. My uncle started accelerating. He was trying to reach the lead vehicles to close the gap, but the piste curved and dipped through low dunes, and within minutes, we had lost sight of everyone ahead. I heard the radio crackle. Someone's voice, I think it was Nadia's father, shouted to pull off the track and seal the windows. Then the signal broke. After that, nothing. The wall hit us before we could even stop properly. 1 second, I could see 50 meters ahead. Next, I could not see the hood of the vehicle. The sound was not a howl or a whistle like the stories describe. It was a roar, a sustained, grinding roar, as if the earth itself was being pulled apart and fed through metal teeth. The car rocked, not gently, violently, each gust slamming the side panels like a fist. My aunt started reciting Quranic verses. My mother grabbed my hand so hard I felt my knuckles fold. We sat like that for what I estimated was 40 minutes, though it could have been 2 hours. When the wind dropped enough for us to crack a window and breathe without choking, we looked out and saw a desert that no longer resembled the one we had entered. The dune lines had shifted. The track was gone, completely erased. My uncle got out to look and sank to his knees in sand that had not been there before. Fresh accumulation, a meter deep against the passenger side. That was when I noticed we were alone. All 12 vehicles gone. The convoy that had been behind us, in front of us, was simply absent from the horizon in every direction. I kept expecting headlights to appear, kept thinking someone would emerge through the haze. Nothing, just orange sky, and silence, and the smell of heated sand that gets into the back of your throat like chalk. My uncle walked 300 meters in each direction. He came back without speaking and sat in the driver's seat, staring forward. That scared me more than the storm itself. He was not a man who went quiet easily. We had been sheltering near a low ridge when the storm hit, and it was only then that I noticed the overturned truck. It was not one of ours. An old cargo truck, faded green, flipped onto its side against the ridge base, half buried. It had probably been there for years, but under the exposed undercarriage, in the shadow of the chassis, I saw movement. I grabbed my uncle's arm and pointed. Nadia was underneath it. She was on her knees, hunched forward, her wedding dress completely gray with dust, both arms wrapped around 2 small children. My youngest cousins, Salma, who was 4, and Yusuf, who had just turned 7. She had somehow gotten separated from the lead vehicle, had found the overturned truck, and had pulled the children under it when the storm hit. She had been there the whole time, not 200 meters from us, completely invisible in the storm. I ran to her. She did not cry when she saw me. She just looked up with eyes so dry from the grit they had turned pink, and she said in a flat, exhausted voice, "Where is my father?" I did not answer. I didn't know. I carried Salma back to the Land Cruiser. My mother took the children inside and started cleaning their faces with a dampened cloth. Nadia walked by herself. She sat in the back without speaking, without asking again, which told me she already understood what my silence meant. We tried the radio for another hour. We got fragments. A man's voice once said something about the rear vehicles stopping at a dry riverbed, and we heard Nadia's uncle's name spoken by someone, but the signal was too broken to confirm anything. My uncle decided we would wait until the air fully cleared, then drive in the direction the track had run, following the old compass bearing he had memorized from the journey out. We drove for 6 hours. We found 3 of the vehicles stopped together near a limestone outcropping, passengers shaken. One woman with a gash on her forehead from when a window cracked, but alive. They had not been able to raise anyone either. One of the drivers said he had seen the last 4 vehicles in the convoy before the storm took visibility completely, and that they had been far behind, too far. By the time we reached the first village with a functioning telephone, it was the following afternoon. Search parties went out that evening. Military assistance was requested. Over the next 3 days, they found 9 of the 12 vehicles. Passengers were dehydrated, frightened, but present. The 3 missing vehicles were found on day 4, 2 of them within kilometers of each other, occupants safe. The 3rd vehicle, the one carrying Nadia's father, her 2 uncles, and a family friend, was found on day 6. The vehicle itself was intact, not damaged, sitting in a bowl between 2 dunes that had formed around it during the storm, essentially sealing it in a sand pocket. All 4 men were inside. They had died of heat and carbon monoxide. Someone had run the engine trying to keep cool, not realizing the exhaust pipe was buried. It was the most quietly devastating thing I have ever had to understand. Not violence, not sand. A decision made in darkness and fear that had no warning and no remedy once made. Nadia was told outside the village clinic while Salma and Youssef were still inside with a nurse. She stood completely still for a long time. Then she asked if she could see her father. They said not yet. She nodded and sat down in the dust and her ruined wedding dress right there on the ground, and I sat beside her because there was nothing else to do. The wedding never happened. It was formally postponed, and then, as these things sometimes go in the aftermath of grief, never rescheduled. Nadia married someone else 2 years later. A quiet ceremony, no caravan, no convoy, nothing crossing the desert. I was there for that too. I still think about those 40 minutes inside the Land Cruiser when the storm was at its peak. How we were all contained in that small metal box surviving, and 300 meters away, Nadia was doing the same thing under an abandoned truck. And 6 kilometers behind us, 4 men were making a decision in the dark that none of us could reach in time to stop. The desert does not discriminate between the careful and the unlucky. It simply receives whatever the wind brings, and it keeps what it keeps. Story 2. My name is Daria Hosseini, and I was 14 years old the day I thought I was going to watch 8 children die in front of me. It was a Tuesday in late spring, and we were on the school bus heading back from a district science fair in the center of Zabal. There were 15 of us altogether, me, 3 girls from my class, and 11 younger students, some as small as 6 years old. Mr. Farhad was driving. He was a heavy man in his 50s, who always kept a prayer bead hanging from the mirror and drove with one hand. I was sitting in the second row because I had won second place at the fair, and Mr. Farhad had told me to sit near the front so he could congratulate me properly when we stopped. I remember feeling proud. I remember that specifically because pride was the last thing I felt for a very long time after that afternoon. The storm came from the west, from the direction of where Lake Hamoun used to be before it dried into nothing. Everyone in Zabal knows the dust comes from there. The lake bed is pure salt and silt now, and when the wind picks up, it throws that dead earth into the air like a weapon. We had seen storms before, bad ones, but I had never seen one move that fast. I was looking out the window, and within seconds the visibility dropped to nothing, not reduced, gone, like someone had pressed a gray blanket against every window simultaneously. Mr. Meter, Farhad swore under his breath and slowed the bus. He picked up the radio handset to call the school dispatcher. Then he made a sound I cannot properly describe. Not a scream, something lower and wetter. He dropped the handset, and his whole body tilted sideways against the door. His foot came off the brake. The bus rolled forward slowly, drifting, until the front left wheel dropped into a shallow roadside ditch, and we stopped with a jolt that knocked 2 of the younger children off their seats. I was up immediately. I did not think. I moved to him and grabbed his shoulder, and he was conscious, but his face had gone the color of old paper, and he was clutching his left arm against his chest with his right hand. Heart attack. I knew it because my grandfather had died of one 4 years earlier, and I had been in the room. The expression on a person's face in that moment is not something you forget. I told the girl behind me, Shirin, who was 12, to hold Mr. Farhad upright and not let him fall forward. Then I pulled the handset from the floor and pressed the call button. I told the dispatcher our bus number. that the driver was having a medical emergency and that we were somewhere on the road between the civic center and the school. The dispatcher's voice came back broken and then disappeared entirely. The storm was eating the signal. I tried 3 more times. Nothing. The children were starting to panic. The 6-year-olds in the back were crying, and one boy, Armin, was trying to open the emergency exit at the rear. I walked back and held the handle shut and told him in a firm voice that opening it would fill the bus with sand that would go into his lungs and he would not be able to breathe. He stopped pulling. Children that age respond to specific consequences. Vague reassurances do not work. I had learned that from helping my mother with my younger siblings. I went back to the front. Mr. Combi, Farhad was still breathing, but he had lost consciousness. Shirin was holding him awkwardly, frightened, her arms shaking. I propped him against the window with a rolled jacket wedged between his shoulder and the glass, and I put 2 fingers on his wrist and felt a pulse, faint but present. There was nothing else I could do for him medically. That helplessness sat in my chest like a stone. What I could control was the bus. I counted the children, 15, including myself. I counted the water bottles left from lunch. 7 bottles, most of them partially full. The storm outside was producing a constant pressure against the bus panels, a sound like sustained grinding that made it hard to think clearly. I stood at the front, and I told everyone to listen to me. Farhad was sick, and that help was coming, that we needed to stay calm and stay seated, and that I was in charge until an adult arrived. A boy named Daniil, who was 9 and apparently felt this was negotiable, said I was not a teacher. I told him that was correct and that he could either help me or sit quietly, but that arguing was not a third option. He sat down. I rationed the water by age. The youngest children got first priority. I tore a piece of fabric from my own dupatta and dampened it so the smallest ones could hold something wet against their mouths. It was partly practical and partly psychological. Having something to hold calmed them. I assigned the 3 oldest girls specific younger children to sit with and monitor. I gave each of them a job title. Shirin was the medical monitor, meaning she watched Mr. Farhad's breathing. A girl named Gulnaz was a water distributor. Another named Roya was assigned to keep count of all children every 30 minutes and report to me. Structure was the only thing I had to offer, so I built as much of it as I could. The hours passed in a way that is difficult to explain. Time became strange. The storm did not relent. At one point, around what I estimated was the 3rd hour, our man began hyperventilating, taking short, rapid breaths, and I recognized it as a panic response. I sat beside him and breathed slowly and loudly and told him to copy me. It took about 4 minutes, but he came down. His younger sister, who was also on the bus, watched the whole thing and then reached over and held his hand. And something about that small gesture nearly broke my composure completely. I turned away so the children would not see my face. Mr. Farhad's breathing changed around the 5th hour. It became shallow in a way that frightened me. I repositioned him slightly and kept checking his pulse every 15 minutes. It stayed present, weak, but present. I told myself that as long as I could feel it, he was alive, and as long as he was alive, the situation had not crossed the line I was afraid of crossing. In the 6th hour, Gulnaz told me we had 1 bottle remaining. I split it across the youngest 4 children and told everyone else that help was almost here. I did not know if that was true. I said it because it needed to be said. The rescue came in the 7th hour. I heard the vehicle before I saw anything. A horn, then voices, then a banging on the bus door. 2 emergency workers in masks pulled the door open, and the outside air rushed in, thick and gritty, but moving, real. They saw Mr. Farhad immediately and called for a stretcher. He was taken out first. I stood at the door and counted every single child off the bus before I stepped down myself. Mr. Farhad survived. He had a cardiac event. That was the official term, and he spent 11 days in a hospital in Zabal before being transferred to Zadin. I was told months later that the speed of intervention, even imperfect intervention, had been a factor in his survival. I do not know how much of that is true and how much was said to make me feel better. I accepted it either way. What I know for certain is that Lake Hamoun should not be empty. I know that what came through those windows was not a natural disaster in the way people use that phrase. It was the consequence of decades of water mismanagement and drought, and international indifference to a region that nobody with power thinks about until something goes wrong. Those children breathed that dead lake all afternoon. We all did, and nobody who caused that emptiness was ever held responsible. I still have the second place ribbon from the science fair. It is in a drawer. I have not looked at it since that day. Story 3. I never wanted to go back to Merzouga. Not after what happened in the summer of 2006. But people keep asking me about it. So here it is. The whole truth. The way it actually happened. I was 29 at the time, working as a junior legal interpreter for a Moroccan law firm based in Marrakech. We were brought in to assist with a murder investigation near the Saharan fringe, about 40 kilometers outside Merzouga. A local man named Driss had been found dead, and his cousin, Younes, was immediately arrested by the gendarmerie. The alleged weapon, a long-handled agricultural blade, had been found 12 meters from the body, half buried in loose sand. I was there to translate between the French-speaking prosecutors and the Amazigh-speaking witnesses. Simple enough job on paper. I had no idea what it would cost me. When I arrived at the site with the legal team, the atmosphere among the locals was already charged. People were whispering that the killing had been a dispute over inherited land, a feud that went back 2 generations. Younes was a quiet man, his late 40s. When they brought him out to the site for an initial walkthrough, he looked not so much guilty as completely hollowed out, like something inside him had already died alongside Driss. I remember thinking that was either the face of grief or the face of a man who had accepted his fate. I still don't know which one it was. The gendarmerie had marked the body's resting position with iron stakes before the medical examiner removed it. The blade had been photographed in place. Everything was documented. And then, around 4 in the morning of the second day, the storm came. I was sleeping in a small guest house in Merzouga when the walls started shaking. The staff were running through the corridors telling everyone to stay inside and seal the windows with whatever cloth was available. I could hear the sand hitting the glass like thrown gravel. It lasted nearly 6 hours. When it was over and we drove back out to the site, I genuinely could not process what I was seeing. The iron stakes were gone, either pulled free or buried completely. The sand across the entire area had shifted by what the geologists later estimated was between 8 and 14 meters in certain directions. The shallow markers were gone, and the blade, which had been logged as lying 12 meters northwest of where the body was found, was now partially exposed 21 meters to the southeast. That's not a small discrepancy. That's a completely different crime scene. The lead prosecutor, a meticulous man named Hafid, stood in the middle of what used to be a documented murder site and said nothing for a long time. I watched him calculating. I could see in his expression the moment he understood that the entire evidentiary foundation of the case had just been rearranged by the desert. The defense attorney, a sharp woman named Nadia, who had come up from Casablanca, was almost immediately on it. She hired 2 geomorphologists within a week. Their testimony at trial was devastating for the prosecution. They explained how Habub-style sandstorms in the Saharan fringe could displace loose objects, including evidence weighing several kilograms by significant distances. They used precise wind data, particulate modeling, and historical storm records to show that the blade's new position was entirely consistent with aeolian transport. In plain language, the wind moved it. The prosecution couldn't prove it hadn't. But what kept me awake at night wasn't the legal argument. It was the witness I interviewed on the 3rd day after the storm. Her name was Fatima, an elderly woman who lived in a small structure about 300 meters from the crime site. She had not come forward initially. When she finally agreed to speak to me, only to me, she said not to the uniformed officers. She told me that on the night of the killing before the storm, she had seen 2 figures near the location where the body was later found. Not 1, 2. I reported it immediately to Hafid. I translated her statement verbatim. I did everything correctly, but Fatima was 81 years old, partially blind in one eye, and had given a previous statement to the gendarmerie, in which she said she had seen nothing unusual that night. The defense used the contradiction aggressively. The prosecution couldn't rely on her, and since the physical evidence was now legally compromised beyond reasonable use, Younes was eventually acquitted. I sat in that courtroom when the verdict was read, and I felt sick. Not because I was certain he was guilty. I wasn't certain of anything anymore. I felt sick because I understood then that the desert had not just moved the blade, It had moved the truth, physically relocated it somewhere we couldn't reach. After the acquittal, I stayed in Mursoga for 2 more days to wrap up the documentation. On my last evening there, I went back to the site alone. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to stand in that empty space and make peace with what had happened. The sand was smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever occurred there at all. No markers, no trace of the stakes, no evidence of a man's death or another man's trial, or 6 months of legal argument. Just flat, pale sand going on in every direction. And then I saw the blade. It was exposed again, clearly visible, resting in a slight hollow, maybe 30 meters from where I was standing. The storm had revealed it once, buried it partially, and now the ordinary desert wind had uncovered it again. I stood there looking at it for what felt like a long time. I took out my phone and photographed it. I called Hafid. He told me it didn't matter anymore. The case was closed, the acquittal was final, and there was nothing left to do with a piece of evidence in a concluded trial. He was right, legally, but I walked over to it anyway. I crouched down and looked at it without touching it. There were still dark stains on the metal that the sand hadn't cleaned away. I thought about Driss. I thought about Fatima's 2 figures. I thought about Yunus's hollow face. And I thought about how the desert had made it impossible for any of us to ever really know what happened out there. I left Morocco the next morning. I transferred out of criminal law interpretation within the year. I told myself it was for practical reasons. Better pay in commercial translation, less travel, more stability. But the truth is, I couldn't stomach walking into another courtroom and knowing what I now knew, that evidence is only as reliable as the ground it sits on, and that sometimes the ground itself has other plans. I still have those photographs on an old hard drive somewhere. The blade lying in the sand, the horizon flat and empty behind it, the light making everything look clean and permanent. I've never deleted them. I'm not sure why. Maybe because they're the only proof I have that any of it was real, that a man died, that another man went free, that the desert swallowed the difference between the two. Some nights I think about Yunus, wherever he is. I think about whether he's living quietly with family somewhere, or whether he's carrying something heavier than acquittal. I'll never know. That's the part that stays with you. Not the fear, not the strangeness, just the not knowing, stretching out ahead of you like sand. Sandstorms in the Sahara can move objects weighing several kilograms over distances exceeding 20 meters in a single storm event. In criminal law, displaced physical evidence can constitute grounds for reasonable doubt, regardless of prior documentation. The Saharan fringe region of southeastern Morocco experiences frequent Habub-style storms, particularly between May and September. Eyewitness testimony that contradicts prior statements is generally considered legally unreliable without corroborating evidence.